All right, welcome everybody. Just gonna give people a minute just to join the call, but then we will get started shortly. All right, welcome everyone. I'm just gonna give people about 30 seconds just to jump in here, and then we will get started. All right, it seems to be slowing down. All right, let's get started here. All right, everyone, thanks so much for joining tonight. I hope the information I'm going to present to you is helpful. I'm Drew Heilpern from Summit Educational Group. And before I dive in, just a couple quick logistical things. The first one is I am going to cover a lot of ground in a relatively short amount of time tonight. Please don't feel like you have to hang on my every word. I'll obviously feel flattered if you do, but we are recording this. You should get the link to the recording tomorrow or on Wednesday. That way, if you want to go back and rewatch or re-listen to any of this, you'll have the opportunity to do so. Also, if you have any friends or colleagues who you think might be interested, definitely feel free to forward the link onto them. Also, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to type those questions in the Q&A box that you should have on your screen. Just in the interest of time, I'll hold questions to the end, but I'll keep an eye on the time, keep us moving tonight, and make sure I circle back and answer any questions that you have. But three major goals for the presentation tonight. The first one is really just to put these tests in context for you. They are not the be all end all of the college admission process. Your students' lives do not depend on their SAT or ACT scores. Having said that, though, I don't want us to completely put our heads in the sand either around these tests, because depending on the schools that ultimately end up on your students' list, there are schools out there that will see the scores, consider the scores, put a little bit of weight on those scores. But anything we can do to keep these tests in perspective and not give them more life than they deserve is always helpful. And then second goal tonight, as the title suggests, just going to walk you through and do a deeper dive on the current versions of the ACT and the SAT, just so you have a better understanding of what these tests now look like and a little bit of a deeper understanding in terms of some of the differences between these tests. And then third goal tonight, I'll just end this presentation by talking about a testing plan. At a high level, I'll give you some general guidelines, some things to think about as you're thinking about your students' standardized testing plan. All right, so with that as a quick intro here, let's dive in. So I start with this slide. I start here because this is back to that idea that at the end of the day, these really are just tests. Again, not the be all end all of the college admission process. And what we're looking at here is just some of the different factors that are going to go into that final admission decision. And the main take home message that I want you to have from this slide is please keep in mind that the number one thing that colleges are looking at is the student's grades, their transcript, their day in and day out performance in school. Next thing they're going to look at is what's called strength of curriculum. You'll also hear this referred to as rigor of the curriculum. Did students challenge themselves academically? Did they take advantage of the academic opportunities presented to them? And then for those schools that consider or look at standardized testing scores, the two major tests are SAT or ACT. Colleges accept both these tests equally. So really it's up to your student to decide kind of do they want to go down an SAT path or do they want to go down an ACT path? And if your student's in AP classes and taking AP exams in May and chooses to submit those AP scores as part of their application, colleges will see those scores, consider those scores as well. But even those colleges that are getting, for instance, like 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 plus applications now, they are reading the student essays that are part of those applications. They absolutely are reading the counselor and teacher recommendations. They are looking at your students' extracurricular activities, any position of leadership they may have had, any work experience they may have had. And all of these factors are going to go into that final admission decision. And for those of you going through the college process for the first time, the term you'll hear around this process is what's called a holistic review. And what the colleges are doing with this holistic review is they're really trying to get to know the applicant as a person, not just as a number. So they're not just going to take a student's grades or GPA and put it in some kind of formula with their SAT or ACT scores. With this holistic review, all of these factors are going to go into into that final admission decision. And I do just want to take a minute just to talk about the test optional schools and the test optional school landscape, just so you have a better understanding in terms of what it looks like and what it means for our students. So I'll start by saying that I know that there are some schools that have gone back to requiring standardized testing. And when they made these announcements to go back, they did get a lot of publicity for that decision. But please keep in mind that roughly 80 to 85% of colleges and universities have continued their test optional policies. So whether your students, a ninth grader, a 10th grader, an 11th grader, we can say with a high degree of confidence that they absolutely are still going to be applying in this test optional environment. So what that means is when they apply to a test optional school, kind of as the name implies, is that they're in control of their standardized testing scores. So they decide whether they want to submit those scores as part of their application or not. So just in the fall of senior year, they're looking at their SAT or ACT scores. They feel good about those scores. They feel like those scores are reflective of the work they've been doing day in and day out in school. They feel like those scores will be supportive of their application. Even though they are applying to a test optional school, by all means, they'll include those scores as part of their application. Those college admission officers will see those scores, consider those scores in their overall application read. But just if for whatever reason, right? Those scores came back a little bit lower than what that student was hoping for or expecting, just really not reflective of what they're capable of academically. They are not obligated to send that score. That college admission officer from that test optional school is not going to see that score. Most importantly, they're not going to try to guess in terms of what that score may have been. They don't have time for that. So if your student applies to a test optional school without standardized testing scores, what they're probably going to do is a little bit of a deeper dive on those grades, on that transcript, on that rigor, just to reassure themselves that that student can handle the rigors of that particular college or university. And again, almost all colleges and universities have continued their test optional policies, but there are some schools that have gone back to requiring standardized testing. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but it does give you a feel for the type of schools that have gone back. So, for instance, this is where we find the Harvards of the world, the Dartmouths of the world, the Stanfords of the world. Also, if your student's looking at some of the larger state schools, particularly in the South, like University of Florida, University of Georgia, University of Texas at Austin, for instance, they've all gone back to requiring standardized testing. But knowing there's going to be a number of schools on your student's final list that are test optional, I really encourage students to see these tests almost as a chance to show off a little bit. And knowing there's going to be a number of test optional schools on their final list, I really want them to see these tests with kind of that everything to gain, nothing to lose mindset. Now, there are some caveats to the test optional landscape just to be aware of. The first one is if your student's looking at some of those more or most selective test optional schools, and I'm thinking about kind of like the Duke Universities of the world here or the, University of Chicago's, we are seeing the percent of applicants applying to these types of institutions with standardized testing scores is starting to tick back up. Also, if your student happens to be a recruited athlete, depending on the sport, depending on the league, depending on the coach, even though they're applying or being recruited from a test optional school, we are still hearing from some coaches that they're asking for standardized testing scores as part of that recruitment process. And I think the reason for that is just those colleges want to ensure that their college coaches are recruiting student athletes that meet a certain academic standard or threshold, and standardized testing scores might still be part of that recruitment process. But if your student is a recruited athlete from a test optional school, they can always just check in with the coach. The coach will be able to tell them whether they're going to need standardized testing scores as part of this process or not. And then they also should be able to give them a range of scores. So they should be able to give them a feel in terms of kind of where that they're ultimately hoping that that score is going to come in. And then sort of the third caveat around the test optional landscape is just around this idea of merit scholarship awards. So what a merit scholarship award is generally a non-need based financial aid award. For those colleges that give merit scholarship awards, they're using it as a recruitment tool. So they are trying to entice strong students to apply and ultimately enroll at their institution. And the reason why I talk about merit scholarships here under this kind of test optional umbrella is just be aware that there are schools out there that admit test optionally, but when they consider these merit scholarship awards, they might still be factoring in standardized testing scores. Now, the college admission folk, they try to be as transparent in their policies as they can be. So if your student's looking at a test optional school that you know gives merit scholarship awards, they can always just ask the school, do you consider standardized testing scores as part of the merit scholarship process or not? And they'll be able to give you an honest answer in terms of what their policies are. And then the last point that I want to make around the test optional landscape is just around this idea of strategic submission. So what strategic submission means is, let's say, for instance, in the fall of senior year, your student has 8 test optional schools on their list. With strategic submission, students don't need to decide, okay, I'm going to send my score to all 8 of my test optional schools or to none of my test optional schools. They can actually decide on a school by school basis. So in this example, the student might feel like, you know what, I feel pretty good about my scores to these 6 test optional schools, so I'm going to send them. But maybe for whatever reason, I'm going to hold my scores back from these 2 test optional schools on my list. And you can see kind of pre-pandemic, only about 4% of students nationally kind of knew about this and were taking advantage of this. Then with the pandemic and COVID, in almost all colleges going test optional, you can see that percentage went up 6-fold. Next time this survey is done, I think we're going to be well over kind of 60-70% of students being classified as strategic submitters. Just as word gets out and more students nationally are aware that they can take advantage of this. But this idea of strategic submission, it dovetails nicely with that philosophy that I want students to have in terms of looking at these tests with that everything to gain, nothing to lose mindset. Not only are they going to be in control of their standardized testing scores to their test optional schools, but with strategic submission, they're in control of those scores on that school by school basis. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to hit you with a lot of information tonight in a relatively short amount of time. But if you only remember one slide from this entire presentation tonight, this is the slide that I want you to remember. At the end of the day, helping students hit their full potential on these tests comes down to having a testing plan. And that testing plan, it's answering 3 pretty straightforward questions. Which test should I take? When should I take them? And how and when should I prepare for them? And if your student has this testing plan mapped out ahead of time, it's just going to reduce some of the anxiety that always seems to surround standardized testing. Just students knowing when they need to be thinking about these tests and when they need to have them on their radar can go a long way in terms of reducing some of that stress. And I'll come back to these points, but I do want to make them now. The first one is, I know that there is huge pressure on our students for early and often testing. Just keep testing, and start that process earlier, and earlier. But please keep in mind that performance on these tests, it does correlate with age, maturity, and time spent in school. Everything that students are doing day in and day out in school is helping them prepare for these tests. So what that means is, statistically speaking, most students are going to peak on these tests kind of later in spring of junior year, even into that fall of senior year. And when students are most ready to take these tests is when I want them to take them. And then the second point around the testing plan is, at the end of the day, that quote perfect testing plan is going to be customized for your student. So please do not worry. If your testing plan ends up looking a little bit different than what a best friend is doing, or what a neighbor is doing, or possibly even what an older sibling ended up doing, there's many paths to success here. It's really what's going to work best for your student. All right, so now as we start doing a deeper dive in terms of what the standardized testing landscape looks like, just gonna start by talking about this newer digital adaptive PSAT and SAT. So both the PSAT and the SAT, they're no longer paper and pencil tests. They are now online tests in this newer digital adaptive format. And I will say our students are completely unfazed by taking a test like this online. They are completely in their element on it. But to take the test, just so you're aware, is it's all done through the Blue Book app. So students need to download the Blue Book app onto their device that they will be taking the tests on. And this is true for both the PSAT and the SAT. But the other point that I want to make around the Blue Book app is when students have their official College Board account and they've downloaded the app, and they sign into the app with their College Board account, in addition to taking an official PSAT or an official SAT, they also have access to full-length practice tests. So I think there's like 8 or 9 full-length adaptive SAT tests, and there are 2, I believe, full-length adaptive practice PSAT tests. So for students who are self-motivated and want to do some self-study, that is a great resource for them. Here at Summit, we've developed 4 full-length adaptive SAT practice tests. So definitely feel free to reach out to us to take advantage of those. And as I mentioned, it is a fully online test. But I will say the College Board, the people who write the PSAT and the SAT, they did put a lot of time and effort into developing that Blue Book app. So even though it is an online test, it does have kind of the look and feel of a paper and pencil test. And what I mean by that is they built in some features to just try to make the test taking experience a little bit easier for students. And I won't go into a lot of depth on this, but just to talk about a couple of them here, just so you can get a feel for the tools that are available to them. So we're looking at the verbal side of the test. And there is this annotate button here. So if students click on this, it's going to bring up a highlighting tool. So if they want to highlight anything in the passage, they can. It also brings up an annotation box. So if students want to take notes on the passage, they'll be able to do that. The other nice feature is this answer eliminator here. So vast, all the questions on the verbal are multiple choice questions. On the math, it's mostly multiple choice questions. There are some free response questions, but anytime students are taking a multiple choice test, we know process of elimination is a very helpful strategy. So this answer eliminator, what it's going to allow tools, what it's going to allow students to do is strike out answers that they think are incorrect. They can unstrike them out or bring them back if they change their mind on it. The other nice feature that it has is this mark for review button. So let's say a student's 50-50 on a question, and they know if they have time in this section, they want to come back to this question. They can mark it for review, because then when they come down here where it says question 1 of 27, when they click on this button here, what that's going to bring up is a dashboard of all the questions in that section. So at a glance, they can easily see every question that they've answered, every question that they've skipped, and any question that they've marked for review. So even though it is an online test, it is very easy for students to navigate from question to question throughout the test. The other nice feature that it has is the platform has this built-in timer. So students know at all times exactly how much time left they have in that section. They can hide the timer just if, watching this timer ticking down on them is annoying to them. They can hide it, they can unhide it and bring it back so they know exactly how much time they have left in that section. But this is what it looks like on the verbal side. This is what it looks like on the math side. So almost identical to what we saw on the verbal side. Like here's our answer eliminator, here's our mark for review, here's our dashboard, here's our timer. But the other nice feature that the Blue Book app has is for every single math question that students are going to see on both the PSAT and the SAT, it has this calculator icon. So when students click on this calculator icon, what that's going to bring up is a Desmos graphing calculator. And for those of you who are familiar with Desmos, you know that it is a very powerful graphing calculator tool. So if students have had some experience or some exposure to Desmos, it can be very, very helpful in terms of answering some of the math questions that they're going to see on this test. Having said that, students can absolutely bring in their own graphing calculator, and they can use that in addition to the Desmos calculator or in lieu of the Desmos calculator. And it is an online test. So on the math, students are given scratch paper. They are not expected to do everything in their head or to do everything on their calculator. They absolutely can write things down on that scratch paper, and we highly encourage students to take advantage of that. But this is what taking the test online through the math platform looks like, just to give you a feel for what that is like for students. All right, so now as we start doing a deeper dive, I do just want to take a minute to talk about the PSAT. So the PSAT, it really is just practice for that SAT. Colleges don't see PSAT scores. They don't make admission decisions based on PSAT scores. Anytime students get an opportunity to take an official test under real conditions, especially when it doesn't really count for anything, it's always good practice for them. And I do just want to take a minute just to walk you through the scoring of the PSAT because it can lead to a little bit of confusion. So the SAT, it's still on the 200 to 800 point scale. So 200 to 800 on the math, 200 to 800 on the verbal. But the PSAT, you can see it's on a 160 to 760 scale. So when our juniors take the PSAT in October of junior year and get their PSAT scores back, when they realize that the PSAT is out of 760 instead of out of 800, often the question we'll get is, all right, Drew, so does that mean that I can just add 40 points to my PSAT math score and 40 points to my PSAT verbal score, and that would be my SAT score? And you can kind of tell by the tone of my voice and the way in which I'm talking about this, but the answer to that is unfortunately no, they cannot. And you can kind of get a sense for this the way this slide is organized. But these tests are all what they're called vertically aligned in their scoring. So what that means is you can use a PSAT score as a baseline score for the SAT because it is the score your student would have gotten had they taken an SAT on that day. So for instance, if they got a 600 on the PSAT verbal and 600 on the PSAT math, that 1200 would be their SAT score. The reason why the PSAT is cut off at 760 instead of out of 800, this is in some ways the College Board acknowledging that students are taking this test a little bit early. Um, so, in that 760 to 800 point range on the math, for instance, those hardest math questions in that range, they're just not on the PSAT. So that's why it's cut off at 760. Similarly, on this end of the scale, on the 160 to 200 point scale, there's some easier questions on the PSAT that just aren't on the SAT. But again, with that vertical alignment in their scoring, you can still use a PSAT score as that baseline score for that SAT. But I always try to remind juniors, right? Keep in mind, again, you're taking this test a little bit early. You're taking this in October of junior year. Probably not going to peak on this until late spring of junior year, even into that fall of senior year. So please don't worry if that PSAT score came back a little bit lower than what you were hoping for or what you were expecting. Where you start on a PSAT and where you ultimately end up on an SAT or even an ACT is often two different places. But it does give you a baseline score. It does give you a general sense in terms of where you're starting in this process. All right. So again, the two major tests that the colleges are looking for are either the SAT or the ACT. And colleges accept both tests equally. They do not have a preference for one test over the other. They do not see one test as a superior test and the other test as an inferior test. They are accepted equally. So what that means is it's really up to your student to decide, do I want to focus or go down an SAT path, or do I want to focus and go down an ACT path? And here's a side-by-side comparison of the two tests. And just looking at this slide, um, hopefully you get the idea that there is a lot of overlap in terms of some of the content between these two tests, but very, very different in terms of the philosophies behind them. So the SAT is more of what we call a power test. Just harder reading, trickier questions. There's more misdirection on that SAT, just trying to make things seem harder than they actually are. Whereas the ACT, the reading's a little bit easier. The questions are a little bit more straightforward, but the difficulty of the ACT comes from the pace of it. It's an incredibly fast-paced test. It's almost a total sprint from start to finish on that ACT. So students who walk out of an ACT, or ideally a practice ACT for the first time, usually their reaction is something like, you know what, Drew? I actually didn't think the ACT was that bad. I just wish I had another 5 or 10 minutes per section. If I had another 5 or 10 minutes per section, I really feel like I could have crushed it. But that's where the difficulty of the ACT comes from. Most students feel rushed on it. Most students feel like they don't have the time they truly need to hit their full potential on that test. So on the SAT, again, 200 to 800 on what I'm going to call verbal, 200 to 800 on the math. So it's still on that 400 to 1600 point scale. Whereas the ACT, if you're not familiar with it, the scoring and the structure takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's divided up into a number of different sections. So the ACT English section, that's just the grammar portion of the ACT. Then there's a math section, then there's a reading section, then there's this science section. Don't get thrown off by the word science. It's not like, what's the chemical formula of photosynthesis? It's more of a scavenger hunt than anything. Students are given scientific passages of which they might not know anything about that particular science topic, but really what the assignment is is in that amount of time, can they find the information they need in those passages to answer the questions that they are being asked? So the reason why it's in orange here is one of the recent changes that the ACT made to their test in the hopes of shortening their test and kind of competing with the shorter 2 hour and 14-minute digital adaptive SAT is they've now made the science section optional. So if your student goes down the ACT path, when they register for the ACT, they will be given the option of taking the test with the science or not. And our general recommendation right now, just because there are some colleges out there that are still requiring the science, is to go ahead and take the science section at least once. That way students have a science score if they need it. And that recommendation it's more of a hedge on our part than anything. Just in the fall of senior year, I'd hate for our students to add a college that requires the science section and realize that they haven't taken it with the science, and now maybe they're scrambling to take the ACT one more time just for the sake of getting that science score. So I'd rather have students have a science score and ultimately maybe not use it than not have it and then again realize in fall of senior year that they've added a school to their list that requires it. And, the common example for this one is just Boston University. Even though Boston University is test optional, if a student applies with an ACT score, they will only consider or look at that score if it includes a science score. You can see on the ACT, it also has this optional essay at the end. If you go down the ACT path, you absolutely do not need to do this optional writing. Colleges aren't looking for that writing score. They're not putting any weight on that writing score. Really unclear what they're using it for. Our thought is they're actually using it for absolutely nothing. So again, if you go down the ACT path, try it with the science at least once. That way you have a science score if you need it, but you absolutely do not need to take the ACT with that optional writing. Again, if you're not familiar with the scoring of the ACT, it takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's on a 1 through 36 scale. What colleges see is they see the individual subsection scores, and then they also see the overall composite score. And that overall composite score is just the average of the English, math, and reading sections. With that science being optional, it is no longer factored into that overall composite score. It is a standalone score that colleges can see if they are interested in that science score. All right, so I've mentioned a couple times that both the PSAT and the SAT have moved to this new adaptive scoring structure. So I do just want to take a minute just to walk you through this, just so you have a better understanding in terms of how that adaptive scoring works. So at the 30,000 foot view, when I talk about an adaptive test, what I mean by that is how students perform on an earlier part of the test predicts their overall scoring range, and then the questions that they see later in that test are being used to hone in and refine that student's score. So before I walk you through this, let me just orient us here. So on the SAT, and the PSAT has the exact same format as well. It's divided up into, on the verbal, it's divided up into two what I'm going to call modules. So module one on the reading and writing, then module two on the reading and writing, then module one on the math, and then module two on the math. And what students are going to see in that first module, and this is true of both the verbal and the first verbal module and the first math module, is think of this as being almost like a heat map of level of difficulty of question. So in that first module, students are going to get easy questions. They're going to get middle level questions. They're going to get some hard questions. They're going to get some of the hardest questions on this test. And then, depending on how well students do on that first module, the test is going to send them to one of two second modules. So let's say a student did quote well on that first module. And by doing well, we think that means answering about 60 to 65% of the questions. So students don't have to be perfect on that. But if students answer 60 to 65% of the questions in that first module, when they've completed it, the test knows that that's how that student has done. And based on that performance, what the test has figured out is that this student is somewhere in the 450 to 800 point range. But the test doesn't know where in that range that student is. Is this a 450, a 550, a 650, a 750, or even possibly an 800 level student? So in this quote, harder second module, as the name implies, what students are going to get is they're going to get hard questions, harder questions, some of the hardest questions in this test to figure out where in that range that student is. Let's say a student struggled with that first module. Let's say they answered about 50% of the questions correctly. Again, when they completed the first module, the test knows that that's how they've done. And based on that performance, what the test has figured out is that this student is somewhere in the 200 to low 600 point range. But to figure out where exactly in that range is on this easier second module, students are going to get easier questions, mostly middle level questions. There might be the occasional hard question or two to figure out where in that range that student is. Just note, if a student ends up in this easier second module, their score is going to be capped. So we think the highest score that they can get is somewhere in the 620 to 630 range. Now, going into this test, students know it has this adaptive format, but our general advice to them is don't worry about it. So even though the test knows which second module they've sent the student to, the student doesn't know. So the test is not going to tell them whether they went to the harder module or the easier module. And I just don't want students wasting any mental energy trying to guess which second module they think they got sent to. I'd rather have students stay present, kind of live in the moment, Just focus on the questions in front of them and answering as many of those as they can correctly, because that's how they're going to maximize their score. Also note, when students get their PSAT score report back, for instance, it's also not going to tell them whether they went to the harder module or the easier module. The SAT score report's also not going to say. The official SAT score report that you send on to colleges is also not going to say whether they were in the harder module or easier module. Because you can see there is some overlap in scoring between these two modules in that kind of 450 to low 600 point range. So if a student, for instance, got a 550 on their SAT math, they could have gotten that 550 by going to the harder module. They could have gotten a 550 by going to that easier second module, but it does not matter. A 550 is a 550, regardless of which second module that student went to. But this is how the SAT was able to shorten their test. So they went from a paper and pencil 3 hour test to a 2 hour and 14-minute digital adaptive test. Still have a valid test and still keep it on that 200 to 800 point scale. Now, I will say the ACT, after talking with them, they have no interest in moving to this adaptive scoring structure. The ACT is still very much a paper and pencil test. So just another important difference between these two tests. But I did just want to take a minute just to walk you through the adaptive scoring of the SAT, just so you have a better understanding in terms of how that works. All right, so what we're going to do now is I'm just going to walk you through some sample questions from both the SAT and the ACT, just so you get a better feel in terms of how that power of the SAT differs from that speed of the ACT. Do not worry. I'm not going to like unmute any of you or call on any of you to actually answer any of these questions. This is just for illustrative purposes only. Again, just to give you a better feel in terms of the type of questions that students are going to see on these tests. So the other major change that the SAT made when they went to this online adaptive format is they sort of reconsidered what a passage is. So a passage is no longer like these long essays that students need to slog their way through. They're much shorter now, generally a paragraph or two. And then there is only one question per passage. But just because the passages got shorter, it doesn't mean the reading got easier. It's still a power test. It still requires a close reading, analytical reading, almost a line by line reading of this passage. And this is just an example of a writing question or a grammar question from the SAT. On the ACT, grammar is tested through that first pass or that first section, that ACT English section. Passages are much longer on the ACT. Really what the assignment is here is, as students are working their way through this passage, they have to correct the grammatical errors as they come across them. But the ACT reading is just a little bit easier, a little bit more straightforward. It's more of a peer editing assignment. They're trying to write passages that are in sort of the voice of what a typical high school student might write. But again, the difficulty is the pace of it. The passages are much longer. Can students actually get through all of these passages and grammar questions in the time allotted? But being more of a speed test, it doesn't require that kind of close reading that SAT is going to require. So on the SAT, in addition to having grammar questions, there's also reading comprehension questions. Again, shorter passage, one question per passage. But here's a 19th century British novel that students need to work their way through. Again, just because the passages got shorter, it doesn't mean it got easier. Still requires a close reading, analytical reading, almost a line by line reading of this passage in order to answer that question. Here's what the ACT reading passages look like. They are much longer. This is about a third of what the an actual ACT reading passage looks like. And just to give you a sense in terms of how fast the ACT reading section is, students are given four passages. There's 9 questions per passage, so 36 questions in total, but students only have 40 minutes to get through that. Again, almost a total sprint from start to finish on that ACT reading section. But because of the fast-paced nature of it, more questions along these lines. The passage points to this. In that limited amount of time, can students show that they read and understood the passage, understood that central argument that that author was trying to make? Again, it just doesn't require that kind of deep, close analytical reading that that SAT shorter passage is going to require. Which then brings us to everyone's favorite topic on these tests, the math. These are both about slope of the line, and I chose them because, again, I think they do a nice job of highlighting that difference between that power of the SAT with that speed of the ACT. And you can see the slope of the line SAT question on your screen, so I won't read it to you. But after you read it, just most students kind of have the same reaction that we all have, which is generally along the lines of like, Drew, like, what on earth? Like, I have no idea what this question is asking me, let alone how to actually solve it. So the SAT, they could have asked this in a much more straightforward way. They could have just simply said the graph of the linear function f has intercepts at -2, 0, 0, 2 in the xy plane. What is the slope of that line? And had they worded it that way, most students would read that question and be like, oh, it's asking me to find the slope of the line between 2 points. I totally know how to do that. But this is where the misdirection comes in. For students to figure out that this is all this question is asking, they have to figure out this whole a plus b equals 0 and a doesn't equal b and how it relates back to that earlier part of the question. Whereas the ACT slope of the line question, just much more straightforward, just way less interested in playing that misdirection game. Students are given 2 lines. One of the lines has the slope of 3. What's the slope of that perpendicular line? Now, you either remember that perpendicular lines have negative reciprocal slopes or you don't. If you do remember it, you know it's C, -1/3. If you don't remember that, you're kind of just choosing your favorite ACT letter here and moving on to that next question. There's no getting inside the test taker's head. There's no trying to figure out what this question is actually asking you. You either know it or you don't. Again, that difference between the speed of the ACT with that power of that SAT. Which then brings us to that optional ACT science section. Again, even though it is optional, we do recommend that students, if they go down the ACT path, to take this science at least once. That way they have a science score if they need it. And I will say the ACT science, it is designed to kind of overwhelm students. Most students who encounter it for the first time are like, Drew, there's no way. There's no way in 40 minutes I'm going to be able to answer 35 science related questions that refer back to figures and graphs that look something like this. It's not actually as bad as it seems. Like, I have no idea what a lithosphere is. I have no idea what an asthenosphere is. I don't need to know any of that in order to be able to answer this question. And this is what I mean when I say that ACT science is more of a scavenger hunt than anything. So on this question, according to figure 1, the temperature of the outer core is approximately between. So really what it's asking me is, can I find the outer core? And I know the outer core is there between those 2 dashed lines. And then I know how to read a graph. So I know I'm on the y-axis here. I know I'm between these 2 points here. So I know that answer choice is C. 4,800 and 6,300. I have no idea what I have found. I have no idea what that answer actually means, but I know that that's the answer. And this is where students can struggle with the ACT. Because it's such a fast-paced test, it has the tendency of turning on everyone's voice of self-doubt. And that voice of self-doubt goes something like this, which is, Drew, you did that awfully quickly. Are you absolutely sure that answer choice is C? Now, if I give into that voice, I'm going to double check this or triple check this or even quadruple check this. And on the ACT, students just don't have time for that. So in addition to giving them strategies and approaches, it's also about building their confidence up that they can see a question like this and without any hesitation or doubt, circle answer choice C and move on to that next question. So again, there's a lot of overlap in some of the content between these two tests, but very, very different in terms of the philosophies behind them. With the SAT being more of a power test, more challenging reading, more challenging questions, requires a deeper understanding, a narrower focus of skills, especially on the math on the SAT, where 70 to 80% is algebra. So algebra 1 and algebra 2. Less than 10% is going to be geometry, but more time per question. Whereas the ACT being more of a speed test, reading and questions are a little bit more straightforward. Does require that instant recognition, though, as we saw with that ACT slope of the line math question and that ACT science question. Broader scope of skills, especially on the ACT math, where only about 30% is algebra. So way more geometry on that ACT compared to that SAT. But again, the difficulty comes from the pace of it. Almost a total sprint from start to finish on that ACT. Which then brings us to the $1 million question. And the $1 million question goes something like this, which is, all right, Drew. So we know colleges accept both tests equally. So just earlier on in this process, if we can decide, right, are we going down an SAT path or are we going down an ACT path? It's just taking that potential amount of work and cutting it in half. But which path should we choose? Should we go SAT? Should we go ACT? And I include this cartoon just because there's tons of urban legend out there that this type of student is going to prefer the SAT. This type of student is going to prefer the ACT. At the end of the day, the best way to make this decision is to try both tests, ideally in a practice setting. So that way, students aren't faced with the pressures of taking these tests for real. And then there is a concordance table. So you can compare like a practice SAT or a PSAT score to a practice ACT score. And we run practice SAT and ACT tests every weekend out of our Waltham, Massachusetts office in New Canaan, Connecticut office. So definitely reach out to us to take advantage of those. We can also arrange for students to take the test at home if coming into our office is not convenient for you. So definitely don't hesitate to reach out to us. It's a great first step for students to try both of these tests in that kind of practice setting. And here's the concordance table. Which again enables us to compare an ACT score to an SAT score. Or again, we know that you can use a PSAT score as a baseline score for the SAT. So you can actually take a PSAT score and compare that and put that into the table as well. I know this is a little bit small, so just to orient us a little bit here. So 24 out of 36 on the ACT is the equivalent to about an 1180 out of 1600 on that SAT. And then 30 out of 36 on the ACT, the equivalent to about a 1370 out of 1600 on that SAT. Now, roughly 70 to 80% of students who try both tests are going to score equally well on both. So often the decision, right, whether to go down an SAT path or go down an ACT path, it really kind of comes down to a student's gut instinct. Like we joke with them, like, which one did you kind of hate the least? If you're going to do some prep for it, which one would you rather prep for? Which test do you think plays to your strengths? Which test do you think you're going to have an easier time getting a score that's more reflective of what you're doing day in and day out in school? And I'll also say, if you reach out to us to do a practice test with us, when you get your scores back, in addition to the scores on the practice test, but you also get an itemized score report back, which shows every single question that students answered correctly and every single question that they missed. So even when the scores come back comparably, I would definitely still reach out to us, talk to one of our program directors. We look at score reports all the time. So even though the scores come back comparably, when we start doing a deeper dive in terms of the type of questions that they answered correctly and the ones that they missed, oftentimes we'll have a recommendation in terms of, thinking, oh, the SAT or the ACT might be better for your student. So definitely use us as a resource. Definitely take advantage of that as well. Okay, that next part of the testing plan. Just when should students take these tests? So here's when the tests are offered. So as you can see, with the exception of January, they are offered every single month. A couple years ago, ACT added a testing date in July. SAT added a testing date in August. So like, hooray, your students can test over the summer now if they would like to. But we cannot stress this enough. Please do not have this be your student standardized testing plan. Like, just no one wants students to take these things like 5, 6, 7, 8 times. It's just too much. They have better things to do with their time. Also note that the scores do not just keep going up and up and up and up and up every time a student takes a test. At a certain point, we're going to see those scores start to plateau. At a later point, we can actually see those scores start to drop because burnout on these tests is real. Most students aren't one and done just because the first time they take it, they're always a little bit nervous. But most students are going to peak on these tests after taking it twice, maybe a third time in that early fall of senior year. And we just talked about this, but earlier on, if students can try a practice SAT and try a practice ACT, it helps us choose a path because we're just trying to avoid going like ACT to SAT to ACT to SAT and then rinse, lather, repeat on that in that early fall of senior year. So we don't want to do this. We want to do something a little bit more sane and sensible, which might look something along these lines. So for our ninth graders who are on the call, it's great that you're joining us. You do have a lot of time on this, though. For 10th graders, usually what we recommend is sometime over the summer or late spring, reach out to us, try a practice SAT, try a practice ACT. It might be a little bit early to start prep, but we can at least start thinking about a path. Are we going down an SAT path? Are we going down an ACT path? Also, sometimes for juniors, they'll take a PSAT in October through their school, and then they might wait until sort of November, December of junior year to take practice ACT with us. And then we can compare a PSAT score to a practice ACT score, and then we're kind of also off and running. So this student tried both tests, tried to practice SAT and ACT, scored equally well on both, but had a slight preference for the SAT. So we targeted March for her first attempt, June for her second attempt. Student is in AP classes and taking AP exams in May, so just wanted to build that into their timeline. And then early fall of senior year for her third and final attempt. And keep in mind, these are just sample testing plans, just to give you a feel in terms of what a testing plan might look like. Your student's ultimate testing plan is going to be customized for them. If a student ends up going down the ACT path, it might look something like this. First attempt in April of junior year, second in June, again, AP exams in May, if applicable, and then early fall of senior year for that third and final attempt. So again, we don't want to do this. We want to do something a little bit more sane and sensible. Maybe something along these lines on the SAT path, maybe something along these lines on that ACT path. But definitely reach out to us. Again, we'll help customize a standardized testing plan that's going to be appropriate for your student. All right, in the last couple minutes that I have here, I do just want to talk about superscoring, just so you're familiar with this term. So almost all colleges superscore the SAT. So what that means is if a student's taken the test more than once, what they will do is they will send in the two score reports that lead to their highest super score. So in this case, the student would send in their score report from May and send it in from August, because what those colleges that super score are going to do is they're going to cherry pick the highest subsection scores and then recalculate that composite or that total score. So even though the student did not get a 1290 in a single sitting on their SAT, for those colleges that superscore the SAT, and again, almost all do, that 1290 is going to be that student's SAT score. Now, a couple reasons why colleges superscore. The first one is you got to keep in mind that college admission officers, they do read applications supportively, and super scoring's one way in which they can look at that standardized testing score in that most supportive light. The other reason why colleges are super scoring, we all kind of load the US News and World Report college rankings, but published SAT and ACT scores still factor into those rankings. So it is in a college's best interest to be able to report report as high SAT and ACT scores as they can, and super scoring is one way in which they can do that. And let me just reassure you, for those colleges that are super scoring, they are in fact super scoring. They're not playing gotcha here. They're not trying to trick you into sending more score reports so they can see the 580 reading and writing, see the 640. They're not going to ask themselves which one's the real one. Is it the 580? Is it the 640? Should we average it together? They're going to take that 640 each and every time because it's in their best interest to do so. Now, colleges also superscore the ACT. It works the exact same way. This student took February, June, and September. They're going to cherry pick the highest subsection scores and then recalculate that composite. So same story, even though the student did not get a 32 in a single sitting on their ACT, for those colleges that superscore the ACT, that 32 is going to be that student's ACT score. Now keep in mind, with the science section now being optional, the science is no longer factored into that composite score or that overall super score. It will just be a standalone score that colleges can see if they're interested in that. Okay, third part of that testing plan, just how and when should students prepare for these tests? Just as we want students to do something sane and sensible on on the testing side, we also want them to do something sane and sensible on any test prep that they might do. So depending on a student's starting score and their ultimate goal score, most students are looking at about 6 to 15 weeks of study and practice going into that first official test date. But just like with their testing plan, we will also customize a study or a test prep plan for them that's going to work best for them. And in terms of what goes into the prep, there's kind of three major areas. So one is content. So we're making sure that students know everything that's on the test, like all the math, all the grammar. The other is a strategy, just a game plan for every question that they're going to see and for every section. And then taking full length practice tests. We build that into our program as well. It's a great way for students just to build up their stamina, get their pacing down, and also just get more comfortable with the type of questions that they're going to see on these tests. So to learn more about our test prep program, definitely feel free to reach out to talk to a program director or one of our great program directors. But just to give you a feel for it, sessions are usually once a week for about an hour and a half. And then there is 2 to 3 hours of homework. That's where the practice comes in. It's like anything, the more students can put in to the program, the more they'll get out of it. So just students are looking at about, roughly 3 to 3.5 hour time commitment leading up to that first official test date. But again, we can work with you on that. We'll customize a plan that's going to work best for your student. All right, I know we covered a lot tonight, so just to recap, again, we can say with a high degree of confidence that there's going to be a number of students on your list that or a number of schools on your list, students list that are test optional. So keeping that in mind, really want students to view these tests with that kind of everything to gain, nothing to lose mindset. We just talked about this. Definitely reach out to us to take advantage of this. But if your student can do a practice SAT and ACT a little bit earlier on in the process, we get a baseline score, but more importantly, it helps us choose a path, right? Are we going SAT or are we going ACT? And again, many schools on your student's final list will be test optional. They'll be able to take advantage of that strategic submission so they can decide on a school by school basis whether to submit those scores or not. And then I just leave you with this. We know that the number one thing that colleges are looking at is the student's grades, their transcript, their day in and day out performance in school. So a good testing plan, it has to prioritize schoolwork over any kind of test prep. It just doesn't do us any good to raise standardized testing scores if it's at the expense of day in and day out academics. And I know it's easy for me to say on this side of the computer, but really these are just tests. They are not the be all end all of the college admission process. We really want students to think about these tests as a chance to show off a little bit. It's one more data point that they can potentially share with colleges to show that academic readiness. And I'm Drew from Summit. If you're not familiar with us, definitely take advantage of our practice SAT and ACT tests. Feel free to reach out to us for those. And then as you're getting into this, we do one-on-one tutoring, both in-home and online test prep. We do academic tutoring as well. And we also do one-on-one AP tutoring also. All right. Let's see. So my goal was to end at 8. It is 7:58, so we will call that a win. We definitely have some time for questions. So as I'm pulling up the questions, I'm just going to launch a quick poll here. Let me pull that up here. Um, okay, I'll launch it. You can see it on the screen. So if you want one of our program directors to reach out to you, definitely feel free to pull up or to fill out this poll. Obviously, you can reach out to us at any time, but more than happy to have one of our program directors reach out to you directly if you are interested. So I will just leave that up. So feel free to fill that out if you are interested. And let me just see if there are any questions that have come in. And again, we have some time for questions, so please don't hesitate to ask anything that comes to mind. All right, let me see. So there's one question that has come in just around accommodations. So the question is, if students are on, for instance, a 504 or an IEP and are using accommodations in school, are they eligible to get these accommodations for both the SAT and the ACT? And the answer to that is yes, they absolutely can. But just be aware, there is a formal process that you need to go through to get those accommodations on these tests. You will work with your school and generally it's a school counselor to get those accommodations. But also note that if, for instance, your student has accommodations for the PSAT, they will get those same accommodations for the SAT. They will also get those accommodations for any AP exams that students take, but they will not have those accommodations on the ACT. It's two separate tests, it's two separate organizations. So there is two different processes that you will have to go through. But your guidance counselor will help you get those accommodations for the ACT as well. Also note, it is up to the organizations themselves to grant those accommodations. Obviously, the guidance team in your school will help you with that application process, but it's not up to the guidance team to grant those accommodations. It comes from the College Board for the SAT and then the ACT folk for that ACT. And then just as a quick follow-up point, also note that if your student takes these tests with an accommodation under HIPAA laws, it is not, it does not say on the score report that your student took that test with that accommodation. So colleges will not know that students took that test with that accommodation. Let's see, follow up to that point. So if your student, has accommodations, do you find students with extended time do better on the SAT or do better on the ACT? So the first step for students, generally speaking, is if students have accommodations, we still encourage them, reach out to us. The most common one is extended time. If students have those accommodations, we still encourage students to take a practice SAT with the extended time and a practice ACT with the extended time, just to kind of get a sense so they can get a better sense in terms of what taking these tests with that extended time actually looks like. Having said that, all things being equal, generally for students who have accommodations for both tests, we will sometimes lean into the ACT. It just the reading's a little bit more straightforward and the questions are a little bit more straightforward. So with that extended time, if the pacing of the test becomes a little bit more manageable, sometimes students have a little bit of an easier time with that ACT compared to kind of that trickiness of the SAT. Having said that, there is a lot more reading on the ACT than there is on the SAT now with those shorter passages on the SAT. So that's why it's not a hard, fast rule. That's why I want students to try both. I know it's a little bit of an investment, especially with the extended time, and try a practice SAT and a practice ACT. With those accommodations. But, all things being equal, sometimes we'll lean kind of into that ACT. But again, it's not a hard and fast rule. We've definitely had students with extended time who prefer the SAT and have ended up going down that SAT path. But thank you for asking that follow-up question. All right, let's see. Anything else that's on everybody's mind here? And of course, you can always reach out to us at any time if you need anything. Let's see. I'm not seeing any other questions come in, which is totally fine. Again, I know I hit you with a lot of info in a relatively short amount of time. We'll try to get the link to the recording out to you tomorrow or on Wednesday, so definitely be on the lookout for that. But let's see. If there's not any more questions, we will end it here. All right. Thanks everybody for joining tonight. I hope this was helpful for you. So appreciate your taking the time and enjoy the rest of your evening. All right. Thanks everybody. Take care.